At the end of Parshas Vayera, Avram Avinu goes through his 10th and final test. He's told by God to bring up Yitzchak as the Akedah, as a sacrifice to God, to see if he'll do it, to see if he's prepared to give up the son through whom he had planned to pass his legacy of closeness to God and devotion to the purpose of creation, and being a partner with God in the fulfillment of his master plan for creation. And now, before Yitzchak could even be married and have children, God's telling him to give him back. And Avram goes through everything, does it all right. It's all good, and he's probably very excited when God says to him in the end, you don't have to do it. And he wants to share the good news with his wife Sarah. She doesn't even know they went. He didn't tell her about this mitzvah, this opportunity, this serious situation. She was back home. She was unaware. And for whatever reason, she wasn't included at that point in time. But now that it was over, now that Avram passed the test, and he was able to keep Yitzchak and marry him off and have children through him, he wanted to go home and tell her. Instead, he goes home and he finds out that she's dead. She died. Why did she die? So the Medrash says because she became aware of the Akedah. And there's two different explanations as to why she died. One says because she could see that Avram was about to do it, and her soul left her to think that Yitzchak was about to be killed, even though she was devoted to God too. And the other explanation, probably more likely, is that she thought Avram would not carry out the mitzvah. He would hesitate. He wouldn't do what he was asked to do, knowing how beloved Yitzchak was to him, and that caused her to die. But whatever the reason, she dies because of the Akedah. Now, Avraham doesn't know this until he goes home, and he finds out that Sarah has passed away. She was nifter. And immediately after the Akedah, after it mentions the lineage of Rivka, who's going to marry Yitzchak, because now he can do that part of his life. So it's Parshas Chayes Sarah, and that's where it starts talking about Abraham dealing with the burial of Sarah, and it's quite, it's kind of hard to understand because the man is in mourning. He's probably broken because he loves Sarah so much, and to note that the Akedah was the reason why she passed away. Also, it was such a good thing for him; it's a bad thing for her. And but nonetheless, he has to do what he has to do, and he has to buy a plot, and that's where he buys the Marak Pella in Hebron to bury her from Ephron, the Hittite, and the process, the bargaining takes place, and he buys the land, and it mentions that Abraham came to cry for her, to bury her and to cry for her, and the word livchusa, which means to cry for her. Right, the letter Chof in a Sefer Torah, in Safra, not in a regular, well, maybe in Chumash also, but in the Sefer Torah is small. It's written small. We have a few places where that occurs in the Torah because it's a way that the Torah transmits to us a deeper message of what's going on over here, and we need to investigate. It's a hint. It's a remiss, and so to us we're supposed to mean something. So the Meforshim explained that the small Chof comes to tell you that even though he came to cry for Sarah Menu, he didn't cry excessively for her, even if he wanted to, even if he felt like doing it. He didn't cry excessively for her. Why? Because if people saw him cry too much, crying for sure, that's going to happen. And we have halachas of mourning, or Hilchas Shiva. We have these are things that we have to do, and to not cry for her would look terrible. Would look like he didn't care that much about her, and he certainly did. And for his own self, just therapeutically, you have to let that out. And instead, he didn't want to cry excessively because that would make it look like he didn't accept the din. We do it, it's like a din by the kever to say that we accept. We say Baruch Deine Emes, the God of the judge of truth, because whatever happens is divine providence, and whatever God does is just. So he certainly had to accept what took place and the way it took place, which is even more difficult because in a sense, he was at least indirectly, if not directly, the cause of her death. Now, Kabbalah explains why it had happened this way, specifically with Yitzchak, and it's all connected, it's all deep and meaningful, and that's part of the consolation. But in the meantime, he knows that he was the one that set up the situation according to divine providence that led to her death, and he had to accept that, and he did. That's what the chuf is telling us. A small chuf is telling us that he accepted what God had decreed. It was all for the good, and the way it happened was also for the good. And he moved on. He buried her, and he moved on, and he went right to the next order of business by marrying off Yitzchak, because he almost lost him without marrying him off. So now that became, and like Sarah is almost forgot just like that. Obviously not in his heart, not in his mind. It was real to him the rest of his life. But from the Torah's perspective, everything moves on. Probably one of the classic, one of the most important messages about dealing with grief is also one of the most confusing. And that happens in Parshas Shmini in the Chumash, where an incident takes place. Again, it's almost like the Akedah and Sarah made it to some degree, because it's Yotzi in the clouds, outside the box. It's not just a normal death. Something major happens in a very major way. It's one of the happiest days, not just for the Jewish people, but for all of mankind. It sounds like a simple thing to build a Mishkan, a place for God to dwell. But it's not. I mean, God dwells everywhere. He's in the entire world. It's inside of us even. But specifically like a Beis Hamikdash, a temple, a Mishkan, where the Shekhinah, the divine presence, will descend and go into that, it's got to be amazing. Spiritually, it has the holiness, and every last detail has to be a specific way for the Shekhinah, the divine presence, to come down, so to speak, from Shemaim and dwell in this. And that's what happened. The Jewish people built the Mishkan, according to specification. They had a lot of divine help. God gave them the wisdom to do it, and they were successful. And then Moshe assembled it, and here's the day, the 8th day of the inauguration, and here's the Shekhinah is coming down and going into it, and it's euphoric. The ecstasy, the spiritual ecstasy that everybody experienced because of it was unbelievable. There's no experience in our lifetime to compare it to. And I mean, our lifetime, our Sinai was certainly on that level. But in our lifetime, in our history, nothing compares to that day of joy and accomplishment and fulfillment. And in fact, so much so that it inspired Nadav and Avihu, the two oldest sons of Aaron HaKohen, right, the high priest brother of Moshe Rabbeinu, to freestyle. To show God how much they loved him, how devoted they were to him, and they brought what the Torah calls an unauthorized fire offering, Eish Zara. And it wasn't the right thing to do. Not anymore. Before Mount Sinai, it would have been a great thing. But in the meantime, once God established the halacha and said this is the way to do it, even with the right intention, you can't break that halacha. You can't go against the law, because then it undermines everything. But they did it anyhow. And in the process of bringing their unauthorized fire offering in the Mishkan for the Mizbeach, the altar, it says that fire came out from the Holy of Holies and went through their nostrils and burned their souls up from in them. Their bodies remained intact. They weren't physically burned. It caused their souls to leave their body. And that's another story unto itself, because there's a lot going on here as well. The souls of Nadav and Avihu are very, very important. You don't hear much about them in the Chumash per se, other than here. But in Kabbalah, they're mentioned a lot. And in fact, they're the source of prophecy for a lot of other people who inherit those souls later on in the future. But that's what happens. And they go from the highest of heights to the lowest of lows. They go from joy, tremendous simcha, down to tremendous mourning. The whole nation mourned the death of Nadav and Avihu, not just because the day itself was ruined by this event, but because they also loved and respected Nadav and Avihu. And there's Aaron HaKohen, the Kohen Gadol, who's still feeling bad anyhow because of the incident of the golden calf, and wondering if God has completely forgiven him for that. And now all of a sudden this happens, which compounds the situation, it makes it even worse for him. And he's got to deal on this importance, and he's the center of attention, because other than the fact that they're his sons, but he's the high priest, he's the Kohen Gadol. And this happens to him. I mean, talking about bad things happening to good people, but this is a great person, and this is what he has to go through on this such an important day in Jewish history. I mean, the free fall is absolutely unbelievable. The emotional free fall is incredible. And that's what he goes through. And Moshe, of course, is the uncle, because he's the brother. And he turns to his brother and he says to him, "That's what God told me." Because back in Parshas Tetzaveh, there's a hint this is going to happen in the future. Though Moshe didn't know it was going to be Nadav and Avihu or how it was going to happen. But God said, "I will be sanctified through my holy ones." See Rashi brings it down, speaks about it. It's also back there. And he said that I thought it was you and me, you and I. Moshe says to Aaron, because who are the two greatest? And Moshe is the humblest person in the world, so he wasn't talking out of ego, out of gaiva. But who are the two most important people in the Jewish people? I would have thought is you and I. And that when God said that, he meant that we're the ones who are going to die sanctifying his name. Now I realize that Nadav and Avihu are greater than the two of us. And it's a little bit hard to understand and accept that, given what the Gemara says about them. But again, if you understand the background to the background, then you begin to appreciate who they were, what they were trying to accomplish, and why Moshe says it. At first, it just sounds like Moshe. You're consoling somebody else. You might need to exaggerate. If you ever sit in a house of shuvah, right, where people are sitting shuvah for somebody, all the stories pour out, and they're true stories for sure. But sometimes you feel you want to elaborate or to embellish a bit, because the name of the game is nechama. It's consolation. It's helping people deal with grief, and somehow hearing such nice things about their relatives that have been taken from the world, especially if they go suddenly. What's going on today with soldiers in the south and in the north and all over, for that matter, that you're there to console people. So you say nice things. You don't bring up bad things. You don't bring up mediocre things. You say the nicest things because you want to trying to help the person deal with their grief. And so is that what Moshe is doing? No, Moshe means it. And we understand from what we read why Moshe said what he said and what he means when he says it. But the most important part of the entire story, after Moshe, Aaron doesn't say thank you very much, or bow his head, acknowledge, and say to his brother, I appreciate that. It says nothing. On the contrary, the Torah says, "V'yidom Aaron." Aaron was quiet. He said nothing, and he's rewarded for this, for the fact that he was able to take it in, not in stride, but to not, like, Avram cried. I'm sure that for sure Aaron cried too, and he sat shiva. He had to do all the halachas. For sure he did that. But v'yidom Aaron, he remained silent. Why? Because of what Moshe said, partly, or something else. One of the classic stories of suffering and dealing with grief, aside from these other classic stories, is a story of Eov, otherwise known as Job in English. And the story is famous, where this is really the source of the idea of bad things happening to good people, at least in the general sense. And Eov was a righteous person. He was a great human being. He was a tremendous merit for the people he lived amongst. Everybody liked him. He was not egotistical. He was not somebody who flaunted his, his blessing in life. He was just a good all-round individual, and that's the kind of life that we're supposed to strive to live, and even more so now that we have Torah mitzvahs to live by. But he's an example of exemplary characteristics and how to be kind to the people. And yet, what happens to him? Again, a story that requires a story, because there's always important background information, and it gets even more Kabbalistic if you want to go into it. But on the simple level of the story, God has this discussion with the Satan, who claims that nobody is as great as Avram Avinu was. And the Satan argues that, or so that's what the Satan says, and God says, no. Eov, if you see my Eov, and this is where we get the expression, Al tiftach peh Satan, don't open your mouth to the Satan, because you start to talk about things that gets his attention, especially you talk nicely about somebody, it gets the Satan's attention, because part of his job is to be an accuser of person's sins before the heavenly tribunal. And God did that. He did it specifically, and the Satan picks up on this, and he says, no, he's not so great. And God says, sure he is. And the Satan says, let's test him. And God says, okay, let's test him. And he loses his wife, his children, his family, everything, his money. He goes, again, from the highest of heights, personally, to the lowest of lows. He loses everything. Everything. And does he complain? No. And the Satan comes back to God, and says to God, the same thing. He's not impressed. For some reason, he's not impressed by Eov. And so God says, "You still not impressed?" And he says, "Yeah, because he didn't physically suffer, right? Avram had to go through all kinds of trials and tribulations. Let me damage him. Let me hurt him. Let me cause him to have physical issues and physical problems, and then we'll see how great he is." So God says, "Okay, you can do that. You just can't kill him. Don't take his soul, but you can cause him. So he gets boils and leprosy, all terrible stuff. And again, it's misery added to misery. And then after that, eventually, he starts to complain. And the Gemara says that he wanted to turn the world upside down in its like a plate upside down in its mouth. Meaning he had enough. And the truth is, the Gemara says he never really verbalized it, but he actually felt it in his heart, and God reads the heart, so God saw it, which is an amazing level. I personally would turned on God a long time ago. I mean, I missed the bus by 5 minutes. And already, God, where are you when I need you? Why did you do that to me? Already, just for a simple thing like that. And he's gone through so much, and he held on, but still now he starts to feel like someone's out to get me. I mean, it's hard not to. And to have your emunah and your faith intact after such what's gone on in the last short period of time. And he faltered spiritually a bit. And that caused God to speak to him. And what follows, interesting enough, is not sympathy or empathy, but criticism. God gives him tochacha. He says to him, "Where were you?" This is my favorite lines of all Tanach. "Where were you when I founded the earth?" Where were you? Were you there back at the beginning when I made creation? No. And then God goes on for chapters talking about who he is and what he's capable of doing. Of course, God is not egotistic at all. He doesn't have any gaiva. He's doing this as part of the Musar. He's doing it for Eov's benefit, not for his own benefit. He doesn't have to blow his own horn in front of Eov to impress anybody. He's doing it to teach Eov something. And he goes on for countless psukim, verses, explaining how much he does as God, meaning that is as big as you might be in your own eyes, you're teensy. I love you. I value you. I created you. I take care of you. Don't get the wrong idea. But the moment you put yourself on par with me in such a way as to be able to question what I'm doing, my hashka, as if I might be making a mistake. And that's what the Gemara says. Because the word Eo has the same letters as the word Oyev, which means enemy. The Gemara says it may be, you look up in the phone book for Eov, but you found Oyev, and you thought, or the other way around, looking for Oyev, and you found Eov, and you punish me. No, and God says, no, I don't make mistakes. The moment you start to question divine providence, in a sense, you're putting yourself on par with God, that you understand everything he's doing. It doesn't make sense to me. Human logic is a wonderful device and a great thing, but it can be our biggest curse too. To rely upon it when we need to, and for a positive benefit, you have to use it. It's fantastic, and thank God we have it. We bless God for it in the Shemana Esrei, who gives us das. It's a gift. But to use it in areas where it doesn't apply, to assume that you know enough about everything to be able to evaluate how God runs his world. It's amazing we know as much as we know, and it's amazing that we can appreciate as much as we appreciate, but we have to understand we're dealing with God, the infinite being, that we can't even understand what that means, who's, according to Yeshaya the prophet, God tells us, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. And that's what God basically tells Eov. I understand it's difficult for you. I understand. I did it. I understand exactly. I feel what you're feeling. I'm inside of you. I'm around you and inside of you. This is not strange to me. I know more about you and what you're going through than you do about yourself, because I'm God. And you should know, as Rabbi Akiva said, all that God does, he does for the good. And his Rebbe, his teacher said, Gam to Latov, this too is for the good. Even the bad stuff is for the good, because that's all God can do. He can only do good. But it looks so evil, it looks so bad. And there's been so much happening in life and history that seems to be so against our understanding, our logic of what's good and what's not good. But that's us. We're limited. We don't know, even in everyday life, how many times have we found out that what we thought was a certain way is not that way? It's different. And yet we approach it as if we know all that we need to know. So God says to Eov, he says, listen, you have to understand and appreciate, even though the story might portray it a certain way, but when I take your life into account and what I do in your life and his life and her life and the whole thing, I take into account all of history, the big picture, the large, huge, massive picture that goes back even before creation began, of which you're just a small, tiny part. And I can calibrate and I can calculate and I can make sure to the very last detail that everything is not only just ultimately, even though in the short run it seems like it's not, that it's all going to work out for the best of everything, not just you. And yes, in the meantime, that might mean some suffering. That might mean some loss. That might mean some pain. And even though we have expressions like no pain, no gain, and adversity builds in Hebrew, according to the efforts, the reward, according to the pain, is a reward. Nonetheless, we're humans, and we have a body, and we have a Yetzer Hara. We like comfort. And we like it so much, we're prepared to take medication to avoid pain if we have to. That's part of being human. That's part of who we are. And that's acceptable. And we have laws of Shiva, specifically to help people in pain, to help them get through the situation, because that's our history, that's the world. But you have to always leave it in the back of your mind, if not closer to the front of your mind, that there's a big picture to everything. And we're not privy to it most of the time. Sometimes we get a little bit of a glimpse of something bigger than ourselves. But for the most part, we're not going to see that large, huge, massive picture to much later in history. And that leaves us with only one thing: bitachon and amunah, trust and faith in God's goodness, and that he loves us, and that he means well for us, even when it's not going well according to us, from our perspective, according to our logic. And the moment that a person is able to do that is the moment a person is able to find the kind of consolation that Aaron was able to find, that Eov learned, that Avraham knew. There's a very interesting Gemara. It says that when Moshe Rabbeinu came back to God at the end of Parsha Shmos to complain about how the slavery only increased since he went down to Egypt, didn't get better. He was sent to redeem the Jewish people, and instead he made the situation worse, and that caused him tremendous grief. You see it, the Torah portrays it. He complains to God ever since God doesn't come back with sympathy, doesn't come back with empathy. On the contrary, God says, the Gemara paints an interesting picture. It says that God says to Moshe Rabbeinu at that point, it's too bad they don't make him like they used to make him. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, those were great people. You, on the other hand, why? So the Gemara says, I promised Avraham the land. It's his land. Yeah, when it comes time to bury his beloved wife Sarah, he has to pay top dollar for a piece of land he's going to own anyhow in the future. Does he complain? No. Does he question? No. Yitzchak, he was a Akedah. He was a Korban Tamid. He was a pure sacrifice to God, and yet he has to bounce around from place to place. Digs a well, they fill it up. Digs a well, they fill it up. He also has Esav is born to him, who marries women who practice idol worship. Does he complain? No. Does he question? No. Yaakov Avinu, the chosen of the three forefathers. Take a look. He's got to deal with Esav, and then with Lavan, and then with Shechem, and then his own family, selling Yosef to slavery. Does he complain? Not really. Does he question? No. So God says to Moshe, they didn't even get a chance to see me fulfill promises I made to them, but they trusted me for it. And you're witnessing it coming true before your very eyes, and you question me. Chaval. They don't make him like he used to make him. And of course, Moshe learns his lesson from that point on. He's not the same Moshe Rabbeinu anymore. After that, he goes with God. He learns to trust God for the process. That's his consolation. That's Aaron, a Cohen's consolation. That's V'yidam Ara. V'yidam Ara means there's no question to ask. Sad? Yes. Mourning? Absolutely. I might even need therapy. I may need to talk to my brother. I might need to share my feelings with somebody else. Yeah, 100%. That's human. That's acceptable. That's fine. But some of the greatest pain we feel when we're grieving is a sense of being denied something that we deserve. The sense of that we had something that was taken away from us illicitly. We were, so to speak, in the colloquial, ripped off, cheated in some way. But it's all divine providence. God tells Eov, it's all planned, it's all for the good. And I understand, God says, you can't see that right now. I understand you can't appreciate that right now. But that's why there's a mitzvah of bituchon and emunah, trusting in God, having faith in God. If only because that's the best way to console anybody when it comes to a situation of loss. It's something, we're never ripped off, no matter how much we're never cheated by God. Even if someone does it to us, it's still all part of some master plan that we don't have grasp of right now, but we know, and this is the most important part of all, that God is completely good, God is completely just, and as long as we stick with Him, then we share in that picture too. Hamaki minachem eschem, that's what we say, right? The place. We don't refer to God as Hashem, Elohim, or Shekai, all of the names we use. We refer to God as a makom. We come to some house of Shiva, someone who's lost somebody, that's what we say to them, that God, the place should comfort you. Why hamakom? As the Nefesh HaChaim points out, the name hamakom means that God is not inside creation. Creation is inside God. God is the place of everything. He has complete control of everything. Nobody, as the Gemara says, can do anything without God first sanctioning it. Well, then God's in charge of everything. And if He's in charge and He's completely good, it has to ultimately be for the good of everybody and the world and creation. I'm consoled.